Ever wondered how to preserve meat with something so simple that everyone can do it? This traditional method requires just a single ingredient to improve the shelf life for 20 years or more. And what better way to learn than from the Amish, a community that's been perfecting these preservation techniques for generations. Let's talk about the star of our preservation show: good quality salt. You might think salt is just salt, but there's a whole world of difference between the stuff you shake over your French fries and the kind that can preserve meat for decades. The Amish didn't actually invent this preservation method. They're more like the salt preservation experts who fine-tuned what ancient civilizations started thousands of years ago. Speaking of ancient history, the Romans and Egyptians were preservation pioneers. They figured out that salt was basically nature's pause button for food spoilage. Those clever Egyptians even used salt to preserve their mummies. Talk about thinking outside the box. And while I wouldn't recommend trying their mummification techniques on your Sunday roast, their basic principle of using pure, high-quality salt still stands today. But what exactly makes salt good quality? First, let's talk about what it isn't. That table salt sitting in your kitchen shaker probably won't cut it. Many modern table salts come packed with anti-caking agents, iodine, and other additives that our ancient friends never dreamed of using. What you're looking for is the pure stuff. Salt that's just, salt. Some excellent options include pink Himalayan salt, which comes from ancient seabeds and contains trace minerals that give it that distinctive rosy hue. Sea salt, harvested from evaporated seawater, is another fantastic choice. Celtic sea salt, with its grayish tint and moisture-rich crystals, has been a favorite among traditional food preservers for generations. Rock salt mined from underground deposits can also work wonderfully. Just make sure it's food grade and not the kind you throw on your icy driveway in winter. Here's a fun fact. Salt was so valuable in ancient Rome that soldiers were sometimes paid in salt instead of money. That's actually where we get the word salary from. It comes from the Latin word salarium, which literally means salt money. I guess you could say those Roman soldiers were worth their salt, and yes, that's where that expression comes from too. The Amish preference for pure, unprocessed salt isn't just tradition. It's backed by centuries of practical experience. Pure salt creates the perfect environment for meat preservation, drawing out moisture without introducing any unwanted chemicals or additives that could interfere with the curing process. Think of it as nature's preservative, unchanged since the days when pharaohs ruled Egypt and Roman legions marched across Europe. Did you know that in medieval Europe, salt was known as white gold? Some cities became incredibly wealthy just from trading salt. Venice, for example, built much of its fortune on salt commerce. The oldest known salt works in the world was found in China, dating back to around 6000 BC. That's right, humans have been figuring out how to use salt for preservation for at least 8,000 years. When you're choosing your salt, remember this simple rule: less is more. Check the ingredient list on your salt package. If it lists anything other than salt, keep looking. You're not being picky. You're following in the footsteps of countless generations who understood that the purest ingredients often yield the best results. This might seem like a lot of fuss over salt, but when you're planning to preserve meat for years or even decades, using the right kind of salt isn't just important, it's essential. The beauty of this ancient method lies in its simplicity. While we've sent rockets to Mars and can clone sheep, sometimes the old ways are still the best ways. In today's world of sleek refrigerators and high-tech freezers, you might wonder why anyone would bother with ancient preservation methods. After all, isn't it easier to just toss that meat in the freezer and call it a day? Well, let me tell you why this old-school technique isn't just surviving, it's making a comeback, and for some pretty compelling reasons. First off, let's talk about what happens when the power goes out. Maybe you've been there. A storm hits, the lights flicker, and suddenly your trusty freezer isn't so trusty anymore. All those perfectly wrapped meats start their slow journey towards spoilage, and you're left playing a nerve-wracking game of how long will this outage last? With salt-preserved meat, you can just sit back and laugh at power outages. Your preserved meat will be perfectly fine whether the electricity is out for hours, days, or even weeks. But this isn't just about preparing for emergencies. Think about our growing dependence on modern appliances. Every year, our freezers get bigger, our energy bills get higher, and we become more reliant on a complex chain of technology just to keep our food edible. There's something liberating about knowing you can preserve food without being tethered to an electrical outlet. It's like having a culinary superpower that doesn't require a cape or a power cord. Here's something interesting. The average American freezer uses about 500 kilowatt hours of electricity each year. That's roughly equivalent to leaving a 60-watt light bulb on for 347 days straight. Meanwhile, salt-preserved meat just sits there, not consuming a single watt, doing its thing just like it has for thousands of years. Talk about energy efficiency. But perhaps the most compelling reason to explore this preservation method is the unique flavor it creates. While freezing merely pauses time, salt preservation transforms meat into something entirely new and delicious. It's like the difference between a photograph and a painting. Both capture something, but one creates an entirely new interpretation. The salt doesn't just preserve the meat, it fundamentally changes its character, creating complex flavors that you simply can't get from modern preservation methods. This is also about preserving something else: knowledge. The only product we'll ever promote on our channel is a book by Claude Davis, a veteran prepper, about 126 superfoods and preservation methods from crisis times like the Great Depression and wartime that are impossible to find elsewhere. We decided to promote his book because we are the last generation able to share these techniques and superfoods to our children or grandchildren. It would be a shame to see this information about highly nutritious foods and preservation methods to survive crises disappear. You can also find a book about herbal remedies from Nicole Apelian on their store. If you're watching this on TV, you can look up our channel, Frugal Solutions, on your phone or tablet and find the books by clicking the link in our channel description or any other video description. We're living in an age where traditional food preservation techniques are disappearing faster than ice cream on a hot summer day. As each generation passes, these time-tested methods fade a little more into obscurity. It's not just about keeping meat fresh, it's about keeping our connection to our culinary heritage alive. Think about it. When was the last time you learned a food preservation technique that your great-great-grandparents might have used? The irony isn't lost on me that we're using modern technology, hello internet, to learn about an ancient preservation technique. But isn't that what progress should really be about? Not just rushing forward to embrace every new gadget, but thoughtfully choosing which old methods are worth keeping alongside our modern conveniences. It's about having options and understanding that newer isn't always better. And let's be honest, there's something deeply satisfying about successfully preserving food using nothing but salt and know-how. Let's dive into the fascinating science of salt curing. Don't worry, we'll keep it simple enough that you won't need a PhD in microbiology to understand it. This preservation method is like a microscopic battlefield where salt is your army, fighting against the forces of food spoilage. And trust me, salt is one powerful commander. Here's what happens when salt meets meat. First, it starts pulling moisture out of the meat like a tiny desert wind. Imagine meat as a juicy sponge. When you add salt, it's like squeezing that sponge in slow motion. But this isn't just about drying things out. The really clever part is what this does to all those invisible microorganisms that would normally turn your meat into a rotting catastrophe. Bad bacteria like Listeria, Salmonella, and their troublemaking friends are like party crashers who need moisture to survive. When salt draws out the water, it's essentially evicting these unwanted guests before they can cause any problems. These harmful bacteria find themselves in an environment about as hospitable as a desert at high noon. They simply can't survive without their precious moisture. But here's where it gets really interesting. While the bad bacteria are packing their bags and leaving, certain salt-loving bacteria are moving in. These are the good guys, the beneficial bacteria that actually help preserve the meat. They're like the bouncers of the meat preservation world, keeping the bad guys out while making everything better inside. These friendly bacteria produce lactic acid, which does two amazing things. It further preserves the meat and creates those complex, tangy flavors that make salt-cured meats so delicious. Think of it like a natural version of what happens when you make yogurt or sauerkraut. Good bacteria creating flavors and preserving food at the same time. It's nature's own preservation system, and it's been working beautifully for thousands of years. The lactic acid these beneficial bacteria produce also helps encourage the growth of good molds. Yes, there are good molds. These aren't the scary green fuzzy things you find on forgotten bread. These are specialized molds that contribute to the complex flavors of cured meats. Now, if all this talk about bacteria and molds is making you nervous, remember this: humans have been using this method safely for millennia. Long before we had microscopes to understand why it worked, people knew that it did work. The ancient Romans weren't exactly conducting laboratory studies on bacterial cultures, but they successfully preserved enough meat to feed an empire. The process is actually quite similar to what happens when you make cheese or ferment vegetables. The salt creates an environment where only the good microorganisms can thrive, while the harmful ones can't get a foothold. The beauty of salt curing is that even if you don't understand all the microscopic details, you can still use it effectively. Just like you don't need to understand the chemistry of baking powder to make a cake rise, you don't need to be a microbiologist to successfully cure meat with salt. Nature has already figured out all the complicated parts. We just need to follow the recipe. Ready to get started with salt preservation? The good news is you won't need to raid a chef's kitchen or buy expensive equipment. In fact, you'll only need 3 basic supplies. And I bet you already have at least one of them in your kitchen right now. Let's break down these essentials, and I promise it won't break your bank account either. First up, let's talk about meat, the star of our preservation show. Here's the thing about meat: quality matters. Compare it to building a house. You wouldn't start with shaky foundation materials, would you? The same goes for meat preservation. You can use either fresh or frozen meat, but whichever you choose, make sure it's the good stuff. This doesn't mean you need to remortgage your house to buy Wagyu beef, but aim for meat that you'd be happy to eat right now. Remember, preservation won't magically improve poor quality meat. It'll just preserve it in all its mediocre glory. The meat is the main focus, but it requires the right tools for proper preservation. One essential item is a large container. And when I say large, I mean big enough to give your meat some personal space. This container is like the stage where all the preservation magic happens. It could be a food-grade plastic container, a ceramic crock, or even a glass container. Just make sure it's clean and big enough to hold your meat with some room to spare. And no, that tiny Tupperware container from last week's leftovers probably won't cut it. But the real MVP of our preservation band, the drummer keeping the whole show together, is quality salt. Remember how we talked about salt earlier? This is where that knowledge comes into play. You want salt that's pure as a mountain stream. None of that table salt with anti-caking agents and iodine. Check the ingredient list on your salt package like you're a detective looking for clues. If you see anything other than salt, keep shopping. This might seem like overkill, but trust me, those additional ingredients in regular table salt can throw a wrench in your preservation plans faster than a cat can knock a glass off a table. Now that we've got our supplies lined up, let's dive into the actual process, Amish style. And let me tell you, their approach is beautifully simple. While modern recipes might have you breaking out digital scales and calculating precise salt-to-meat ratios like you're solving a complex math problem, the Amish method is refreshingly straightforward. It's like they looked at all our modern fussing and said, "Hold my butter churn." The first step is almost poetically simple. Take your meat and your salt. That's it. No complicated measurements, no precision scales, no need to phone a friend for help with calculations. The Amish approach is more like cooking with your heart than your calculator. They simply coat the meat with salt, making sure every surface is covered and whatever sticks is exactly the right amount. It's the meat preservation equivalent of measure with your heart. And surprisingly, it works beautifully. Now, if you're the type who breaks out in hives at the thought of not measuring everything precisely, I see you, baking enthusiasts. Take a deep breath. Remember that our ancient ancestors weren't exactly pulling out their digital scales when preserving meat. The Egyptians didn't have precision measuring tools when they were preserving food for their pyramids builders, and somehow civilization survived and thrived. But if you really want the numbers, there's a simple rule that many traditional food preservers follow. For every pound, or roughly 450 grams, of meat, you'll want to use about 1/3 cup of high-quality salt. That works out to around 3 tablespoons per pound. But here's the thing. This isn't like baking a delicate French pastry where a gram off means disaster. One thing the Amish understand well is that different cuts of meat might need different approaches. A thick, hearty ham might need a more generous salt coating than a smaller cut. Use your judgment. If it looks like enough salt has stuck to the surface to create a decent coating, you're probably good to go. If some falls off, that's fine too. The meat will take what it needs, like a picky eater at a buffet. Speaking of salt application, here's a technique that works well. Pour some salt into a bowl and use your hands to apply it. This gives you better control than trying to shake it from a container, and you can feel any spots you might have missed. Just remember to wash your hands thoroughly before and after handling the meat. We're preserving food, not growing a science experiment. Once you've got your meat thoroughly coated, give it a quick once-over. Every surface should have a visible layer of salt. If you spot any bare patches, give them another coating. Think of it like painting a fence. You want consistent coverage for the best results. When you're satisfied with the coverage, you're ready for the next step in our preservation journey. Now comes the part where we need to give our salted meat a proper home for its transformation. This isn't as simple as just tossing it in any old container, though we're definitely not talking about building a custom meat palace either. Let's walk through the storage process that'll turn your salted meat into a perfectly preserved delicacy. Once you've got your meat wearing its salt coat, it's time to find it a comfortable resting spot. The Amish typically use what's called a bus tub, a large rectangular container that gives the meat plenty of space to do its thing. But don't panic if you don't have one lying around. A vegetable crisper from your fridge works just fine, or really any food-safe container that's large enough. Here's where things get interesting, and where the Amish show their preservation wisdom. They like to place smaller cuts of meat on a cooling rack inside the container. This isn't just them being fancy. There's real science behind it. See, as the salt starts working its magic, it's going to pull moisture out of the meat like a tiny dehumidifier. If you let the meat sit in this salty liquid, also known as brine, it can become saltier than a sailor's vocabulary. But wait, there's a plot twist. This rule changes completely if you're working with a large ham or similar big cut. In that case, you actually want the meat to bathe in its briny hot tub. The larger piece will naturally reabsorb some of that salty liquid, leading to more even preservation throughout the meat. It's like the difference between taking a quick shower and having a long, relaxing soak in the tub. Different situations call for different approaches. For smaller cuts, if you don't have a cooling rack, because who just happens to have extra cooling racks lying around, don't throw in the towel just yet. You can improvise. Some clean chopsticks or even rolled up aluminum foil can create a makeshift platform to keep your meat elevated. The goal is simply to keep it from swimming in its own brine. Think of it like building a tiny meat hammock. Whatever works to keep it suspended above the liquid that will collect below. Here's a crucial tip that might save your bacon, literally. If you can't rig up any kind of elevation system, you're not out of luck. You'll just need to be a bit more hands-on with your meat maintenance. Plan on draining off the accumulated liquid once or twice a day. It's like babysitting, but instead of changing diapers, you're just pouring off some salty water. Not too bad, right? The container placement is also important. You want it somewhere level and stable. Nothing ruins a preservation project quite like finding your carefully salted meat tipped over and sliding around like it's at a water park. Also, make sure the container has enough room around it for air circulation. Now that we've got our meat comfortably settled in its temporary home, the next big question is, how long do we wait? This isn't like waiting for a microwave dinner. Preservation takes patience, and timing is everything. Let's start with the optimal storage location. While the Amish have their traditional ice houses and root cellars, your regular fridge will work perfectly fine. And unlike your great-great-grandmother, you don't have to worry about keeping an ice house stocked with blocks of winter ice. Now, for the million-dollar question, how long should you wait? The minimum stay at this salty spa is 5 days. That's roughly 120 hours of quality time between your meat and its salt coating. But here's where size matters. Bigger cuts of meat need more time, like a large ham might need to vacation there for 8 or 9 days. It's like cooking a turkey versus a chicken. Bigger just takes longer. Here's a neat trick to know when it's ready. Watch for liquid. In the beginning, you'll see quite a bit of moisture being drawn out. That's the salt doing its job. Over time, this liquid production will slow down and eventually stop. When you stop seeing new liquid appearing, that's a good sign your meat is ready for the next stage. But what if you're busy and can't check it exactly on day 5? Don't panic. This isn't like baking a cake where 5 extra minutes can mean the difference between delicious and disaster. The window for success is pretty forgiving. Anywhere from 5 days to 2 weeks is perfectly fine. It's like sleeping in on the weekend. A little extra time won't hurt anything. Temperature consistency during this waiting period is crucial. Your fridge should stay at a steady temperature. No playing around with the settings just because you're trying to make room for last night's leftovers. Think of it like taking care of a pet. You wouldn't keep changing its environment, right? The same goes for your curing meat. During this waiting period, you might notice some changes in the meat's appearance. It will likely become darker and firmer. Don't worry, this is completely normal. And remember, this waiting period isn't just about passing time, it's about transformation. Every day, microscopic changes are happening that will contribute to the final flavor and texture of your preserved meat. It's like watching paint dry, except way more delicious in the end. After your patient waiting period, whether you went for the minimal 5 days or embraced the full 2-week transformation, it's time to check if your meat has successfully graduated from its salt spa treatment. This is like the final exam, but don't worry, your meat will tell you exactly how well it's done. First things first, let's do the rigidity test. Pick up your meat. It should feel noticeably different from when you started. We're looking for meat that's taken on a firmer, more rigid texture. If your meat has done its homework properly, it should be significantly more solid than when it went in. But what if your meat is still doing its best impression of a wet dish rag? If it's still floppy and wet, don't throw in the towel just yet. This is just your meat telling you it needs a little extra time in salt school. Just add more salt and send it back to the fridge for a few more days. Sometimes, like stubborn students, some cuts just need a little extra time to reach their full potential. When your meat has passed the firmness test with flying colors, it's time for the rinse cycle. This isn't your typical quick rinse. We're talking about a thorough cleaning to remove all that excess salt. Use clean, cool water and be thorough about it. You're not trying to wash away all the preservation work you've done. You're just removing the surface salt that's finished its job. Now comes a crucial step that many people overlook: drying. But we're not talking about a quick pat with a paper towel here. You need to use a non-pilling towel. That's fancy talk for a towel that won't leave little bits of fluff all over your meat, and really get in there with the drying action. Any moisture left on the surface is like leaving a welcome mat out for unwanted bacteria, and we definitely don't want to roll out the red carpet for those party crashers. The meat should end up feeling not just dry to the touch, but almost slightly tacky. This texture change is completely normal. It's one of the signs that the preservation process has worked its magic. If you've ever handled beef jerky, you're familiar with this kind of texture. It's not sticky like tape, but it shouldn't feel wet or slippery either. Throughout this process, keep your workspace clean and your hands cleaner. Remember, we're in the final stages of what's been a weeks-long process. No sense in fumbling the ball on the 1-yard line. Work on a clean surface with clean tools and keep washing your hands as needed. Now we've reached what I like to call the grand finale of our meat preservation journey. It's time to hang your masterpiece. This might sound simple, but there's an art to hanging your meat that the Amish have perfected over generations. And don't worry if you don't have fancy equipment. Our ancestors managed just fine with basic tools, and so can we. The Amish traditionally use these nifty S-shaped metal hooks for hanging their meat, and I have to say, they're onto something there. These hooks are like the sports cars of the meat hanging world: sleek, efficient, and they get the job done with style. They're curved just right to hold the meat securely while allowing proper air circulation. But here's the good news. If you don't happen to have professional meat hooks lying around, and let's be honest, who does? Butcher's twine works just as well. It's like the reliable family sedan of meat hanging. Not as flashy, but gets you where you need to go. Before you start hanging, you'll need to prep your meat for its aerial adventure. If you're using a hook, you'll want to create a small hole in one corner of the meat. Now, this isn't a job for your favorite steak knife. You want something sharp and precise. You want a clean hole that's just big enough for your hook or twine to pass through. The Amish have this down to an art form, making holes that are perfect every time, like they're performing meat acupuncture. If you're going the twine route, you have some options. You can either use that same whole method we just talked about, or you can wrap the twine around the meat like you're gift wrapping a very special present. Just make sure your knots are secure. Nobody wants to hear that midnight thump of meat hitting the floor. A quick pro tip that might save you some headaches. Before you make any holes or start tying, take a moment to plan where you want your hanging point to be. You want the meat to hang evenly, like a perfectly balanced mobile. If your hanging point is off-center, your meat will hang at an angle. And while that might make for an interesting conversation piece, it's not ideal for proper preservation. Speaking of positioning, think about how the meat will hang. You want it to hang freely, with air able to circulate all around it. Don't let it touch any walls or other hanging pieces. Each piece needs its own personal space, like teenagers at their first school dance. If you're hanging multiple pieces, because let's face it, once you start preserving meat this way, you'll want to do more. Make sure they're not touching each other. Think of it as social distancing for meat. Each piece needs room to breathe. For those working with larger cuts, you might want to consider using multiple hanging points. This helps distribute the weight evenly and prevents any potential tearing. It's like using multiple hooks to hang a heavy picture frame. Better safe than sorry. If you're using twine, you can create a simple harness by crossing the twine in an X pattern. Just make sure all your knots are tight and secure. This is not the time for slipshod work. Remember, this hanging setup needs to last for several days, so take your time getting it right. It's like building a house. A solid foundation, or in this case, hanging system, makes everything else work better. Once you've got your meat securely hung, step back and admire your handiwork. You're looking at the culmination of weeks of patience and preparation. Now that your meat is hanging like a prized painting in a gallery, let's talk about where exactly it should spend its final days of transformation. The Amish have this part down to a science, even though they probably never call it that. Finding the perfect spot is crucial. It's like choosing the perfect location for a new restaurant. It can make or break your success. The ideal environment for your hanging meat is somewhere cool and dark, like a meat meditation retreat. The Amish typically aim for temperatures between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Not cold enough to need a winter coat, but definitely sweater weather. If you're wondering what this feels like, it's about the temperature of a wine cellar or that sweet spot in your basement where you store your potatoes. Now, you might be scratching your head wondering where in your modern home you can find such a spot. Not everyone has a root cellar or a cool storage room lying around. But don't worry, there are plenty of creative solutions. A basement can work wonderfully if you have one. That unfinished corner that's been collecting dust, it might just be perfect for your meat hanging needs. Some people even convert a spare closet into a curing space, though you'll want to warn house guests before they open that door looking for towels. The darkness part is just as important as the temperature. Think of your meat like a vampire. It prefers to avoid direct sunlight. This isn't just about ambiance. Light can actually affect the curing process and potentially lead to uneven results. It's like trying to get a good night's sleep with a spotlight shining in your face. Not ideal. If your chosen spot has windows, consider covering them or hanging your meat in a darker corner. During this hanging period, which should last at least 5 days, your meat will continue to transform. The Amish understand that this isn't just about waiting, it's about letting the flavors develop, like letting a fine wine age. The meat will gradually become drier and more concentrated in flavor. It's going through its final metamorphosis, like a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis, except this butterfly is deliciously preserved meat. Here's a little known fact. The Amish often test the readiness of their hanging meat by giving it a gentle squeeze. They're looking for a certain firmness, kind of like testing an avocado for ripeness, but with much higher stakes. The meat should feel firm, but not rock hard, somewhat like a well-done steak that's been left to rest. Temperature consistency is crucial during this period. You don't want your meat doing the hokey-pokey between warm and cool. Try to choose a spot where the temperature stays relatively stable throughout the day. Basements are often perfect for this because they naturally maintain more consistent temperatures than above-ground rooms. And here's where the Amish show their practical wisdom. Once the hanging period is complete, they don't just dive right in. They often slice their preserved meat thin, like bacon, and give it a quick fry in a pan. This isn't just about heating it up, it's about transforming it into something that would make your taste buds stand up and applaud. The heat helps to bring out the complex flavors that have developed during the curing process, like the final flourish in a well-orchestrated symphony. Finally, after all that waiting and watching. 5 more days have passed, and your patience is about to be rewarded. This is the moment of truth. Like opening presents on Christmas morning, except instead of toys, you're unwrapping perfectly preserved meat. But before you dive in, fork. First, let's talk about the final steps and some clever tricks the Amish keep up their sleeves for getting everything just right. When you first try your preserved meat, you might notice it's got quite a salty kick, maybe even saltier than your great aunt's commentary at family reunions. But don't worry if your first taste makes you reach for a glass of water. The Amish have a brilliant solution for this common issue, and it's simpler than you might think. If your meat ends up tasting like you just took a swim in the Dead Sea, there's an easy fix that doesn't involve starting over or throwing in the towel. Here's the Amish secret weapon: a simple water bath. Yes, you read that right. Just plain, clean water. If your meat is too salty, simply place it in a container of fresh water. The science behind this is pretty neat. Through the magic of osmosis, fancy word for water moving around to balance things out, the excess salt will gradually leave the meat and enter the water. It's like nature's very own desalination plant. The length of this salt reduction bath depends on how salty your meat turned out and how much you want to reduce it. Start with about an hour and test it. If it's still too salty, let it soak a bit longer. It's like adjusting the seasoning in a soup. You can always add more time, but you can't unsoak it. Some folks find that changing the water once or twice during this process speeds things up, like giving your meat a fresh start with clean bath water. Here's where you need to channel your inner Goldilocks. You're looking for that just right moment. Too little time in the bath, and your meat might still be too salty, too long, and you might lose some of that wonderful cured flavor you've spent weeks developing. The perfect balance is when the saltiness enhances the meat's flavor without overwhelming your taste buds. It's like finding the perfect volume on your car radio. Not so quiet you can't hear it, but not so loud it drowns out conversation. Once you've got the salt level just right, your preserved meat is ready for its grand debut. You can slice it thin and fry it up like bacon, the Amish favorite, add it to stews or soups for an incredible flavor boost, or even serve it as part of a charcuterie board that would make any foodie swoon. The possibilities are endless, like a choose-your-own-adventure book, but with more delicious outcomes. And here's the really exciting part. If you've done everything right, and let's face it, with all these detailed steps, how could you not? Your meat can now last for an impressive 20 years or more. That's longer than most marriages in Hollywood. Of course, you'll probably enjoy it long before then because, let's be honest, who has the willpower to wait 20 years to taste something this good? It's like having a time capsule in your pantry, except this one is edible and absolutely delicious. Just remember to store any uneaten portions in a cool, dry place. Think of it as giving your preserved meat a nice retirement home where it can live out its days until you're ready to enjoy it. After all this work, proper storage is like making sure your masterpiece gets the gallery showing it deserves.